Anthony Chisholm. I am a sustainability coordinator here at Westmont. And I'm really excited to bring you guys the first of our sustainability speaker series this semester. So this will be one of 4, we have one a month. Today's presentation is from Sarah Witmer, and she is with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, which is a local organization founded in Santa Barbara, I believe. Yeah. And they talk about, as you might expect from the name, what it means to live in a nuclear age and why it's still important to be talking about these kinds of things. And we'll today be talking specifically, we'll be hitting on why that matters for sustainability. So Sarah has studied international relations and East Asian studies at a political science university in France and at Columbia University in New York. And she moved here to Santa Barbara 2 years ago and started working with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And when she's not at work, she likes being by the ocean and learning how to grow more than just weeds in the garden, which I am a big fan of, and doing some trail running when possible. So yeah, please welcome Sarah with me. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today to talk with you. As Kenny said, my name is Sarah. I've been working at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation for the last 2 years, and I'm really excited to be at Westmont for multiple reasons. I know for one, you have a unique commitment to sustainability that I was reading about online, and that I've heard a little bit about from Kenny and from my cousin Jesse, who also came to Westmont. My mom actually went to Westmont in the 80s, so it's fun to be here kind of walking through campus and thinking about how things all kind of circle around. I think that's really interesting. So as Kenny said, I work for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We've been in Santa Barbara since our founding, which was in 1982, and that was just around the height of the Cold War. By 1985, the world had about 70,000 nuclear weapons. So we've made quite a bit of progress in the positive direction since then. We're down to about 14,000 now, but getting rid of those last 14,000 is going to probably prove to be harder than getting rid of the first, 56,000 that led us to this point. Our mission at NAPF since our founding has been to educate, advocate, and inspire action for a peaceful world free of nuclear weapons. And that has changed and adapted over time. I think as we talk more about sustainability today, we'll talk a little bit about how our perception of what is sustainable in the disarmament movement has also morphed. We work on the international, federal, state, and local levels through our work. Internationally, we have consultative status at the United Nations. Federally, we've done a little bit of lobbying in D.C. and work with federal officials on education around disarmament issues. On the state level, last summer, California actually became the first state to publicly support a ban on nuclear weapons. There's a treaty that the majority of the world's countries have signed, called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And of course, the U.S. hasn't signed that treaty, but California publicly stood in support of that treaty. So that was a big deal. And that actually happened from, or a lot of the work that led up to that being signed into law, AJR 33, started here in Santa Barbara through a little bit of our work and through our work with Monique Limon, our local state assembly representative. So that's exciting. And in addition to that, we do a little bit of work on the local level as well. Santa Barbara was declared a nuclear-free zone a couple months ago, which basically just means that, again, we stand in support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. There's a lot of good stuff on multiple levels that we can tackle when it comes to disarmament. In addition to that, just one other thing I want to quickly throw in is we are a partner organization of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, and they won the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago for their work on the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They've been, again, kind of talking about different ways to adapt to how disarmament is changing and how to make the disarmament movement a sustainable one. So that was really exciting as well. I've been passionate personally about this issue since I was 12 years old. My mom, just after she graduated from Westmont, actually went off to Japan and taught English for a couple years. And from there, my family ended up moving to Japan when I was 12, or 11, actually. So while I was in Japan as a 12-year-old, I took a trip to Hiroshima with my 7th grade school class. We interviewed a survivor, and we just walked the streets and saw the monuments. And there was something about being there that I couldn't look away from. And since then, that's kind of followed me. And now I find myself here, which I feel very fortunate to be working with. So in talking about this idea, the myth of nuclear security and how that ties into sustainability, I was thinking a lot about that this weekend, and I had a really cool illustration fall into place that I thought was great for what we're going to talk about. On Saturday, I was out on the Channel Islands with some friends. One of my friends is a fisherman, so we just jumped on his boat and went out to the Channel Islands. And while we were out there, we just happened across a couple people who, one of my friends knew from town, and they invited us to come and hang out on their boat for the afternoon. And that's a kind of community that's new to me. That's a concept that's kind of foreign from my personality and my culture. I'm a little bit more reserved, and I lived in Tokyo and I lived in New York for a long time, and both of those places are very reserved compared to maybe Santa Barbara culture. A little bit more impersonal, maybe, being such big cities. So I would never be the first person to jump on a stranger's boat and start eating their snacks, and I'd probably never be the first person to invite strangers onto my boat to eat my snacks. But there was something about the way that they invited us. They were so warm and kind and welcoming. And so we spent the afternoon just talking with them on their boat, and I started talking with this one man specifically about nuclear weapons. And in our discussion, he was talking about how, from his perspective, he doesn't know much about the issue, or he's not immersed in it, but people tend to start pointing the finger when talking about nuclear weapons and trying to figure out whose fault is it. The history of nuclear weapons, who is to blame for the way that things have developed over the last 70 years. Whose fault is it that in 1945, 200,000 people died horrific deaths in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, that a third of each of their populations was wiped out in effectively a flash, that many children and elderly people were the first to suffer and suffered the most. Whose fault is it that this weapon of monstrous, torturous destruction was created in the first place? Whose fault is it that our planet could be plunged into nuclear winter in the blink of an eye? So we were talking about this phenomenon of blame, and this man said, I think we struggle to understand that we're all on the same boat. We're all headed in the same direction. We're all accountable. The idea of trying to point the finger and figure out who exactly is to blame is not going to get us anywhere, and I think that applies to a lot of the existential issues that we're talking about today, from climate change to nuclear weapons. Ultimately, that's the point of sustainability, isn't it? That whether we like it or not, our individual choices are interconnected, and we're all on the same boat. And I don't mean that in a sentimental, insubstantial kind of way. I think being on the same boat means we have a serious responsibility to get educated and to take responsibility and to get to work. When you're on a boat, you're sharing a limited space with other people, and over time, the longer you're on the boat, the more responsibility I think there is. That your choices are really to sink or to jump overboard or to maybe walk the plank. I don't know. So when we're talking about nuclear weapons and about not taking action and about being complacent, that could be the end of us. On the flip side, I think the predicament that we find ourselves in now is an opportunity for radical community building and peacemaking, because we have no other choice. So more on that in a bit. But I want to talk about the environmental impact of nuclear weapons and about how our work at NAPF for nuclear disarmament is part of the sustainability framework. I titled my talk "The Myth of Nuclear Security" because prevailing rhetoric and policies throughout modern history have suggested that nuclear weapons are necessary for the security and survival of our planet. Leaders in all of the nations that possess nuclear weapons, the US, Russia, Japan, nations of the EU, China, North Korea, Iran, Israel, and our web of allies all follow that logic, that nuclear weapons are a necessary evil. And I'm here to argue that that's a myth, a damaging and dangerous myth. So with that in mind, just a quick overview. There are about 15,000 nuclear weapons still in the world today, and about 4,000 of them would be launchable in 10 minutes or less. At the push of Donald Trump's nuclear button, which he's openly threatened on Twitter, there we go. These are only the weapons that we know of, which are shared by the US, Russia, France, the UK, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. We don't know whether other countries have nuclear weapons, and we can't even confirm how many usable nuclear weapons each country that we know has them actually does have. Those are rough estimates based on information governments are willing to share, and that individual watchdogs are able to gather. Fissile nuclear material, the stuff that's needed to make a bomb, has gone missing from facilities in Belgium a couple times over the last few years. And there's a serious possibility that terrorists and extremist groups could get their hands on materials to make their own nuclear weapons. So our governments try to find solutions to make sure we maintain a precarious balance where nuclear weapons are never used. Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced a no first use bill to both houses in January of this year, which would prevent any American president from ordering a nuclear launch first on another country. It wouldn't stop us from retaliating on a country that launched on us first. So even if that bill were to pass, though, it wouldn't stop India and Pakistan, for example, from launching nuclear weapons at each other, or North Korea from launching one at the US first. So it's a nice sentiment, but again, it isn't going to get to the root of the problem. So what is the root of the problem? I think it's a problem of mindset and of our modes of thinking. We've bought into myths that nuclear weapons are sustainable, or at least that they're the best choice we have. Just as some politicians and business owners argue that climate change is a matter of perspective while the ice caps melt, there are motivations and incentives to perpetuate the myth that nuclear weapons are necessary. The 9 nations that openly possess nuclear weapons perpetuate these myths, and most average people aren't exposed to the facts that would make them ask questions. So the myths I'm going to talk about today are, 1, that nuclear weapons are a sustainable, necessary evil. 2, that the experts must know what they're doing, so don't worry about it. And even if the experts don't know what they're doing, there's nothing that we as individuals can do about it. And 3, that peace is an unrealistic and sentimental wish. I want to frame this first by understanding what exactly is sustainability. People talk about it a lot these days, and that's a good thing. But it's a buzzword for businesses in all sectors, and you see it discussed with clothing and hospitality, food, entertainment, travel, tech, social media even. Facebook has a sustainability statement about their carbon footprint. We're entering an age where businesses recognize that this is something that consumers care about. And I think in many ways this is in reaction to decades of not considering the future and not considering the fragility of our ecosystem. The environmental movement was partially a reaction to overconsumption and consumerism from the Industrial Revolution. A lot of policies first started to be discussed around the turn of the century, around 1900, when factories were chopping down trees and dumping chemicals into rivers that quickly turned black. And I think nuclear weapons aggravated this materialistic consumerist culture in wealthy Western countries. Post-World War II, the winners of the war thought they were on top of the world. There was a valid sense of relief that the Axis had been stopped and a celebration that justice had in many ways won out. But this feeling of victory was also a bit reckless and short-sighted. We started sharing our nuclear materials with our allies. Under the Atoms for Peace program, we handed Iran fissile material that was needed to start its own nuclear reactors. And at the same time, the U.S. looked at the USSR as a morally inferior enemy and aggravated tensions with its enemies because it thought it had nothing to lose. We didn't compromise or prioritize peace in the long term, and now we're paying the price for it. So what I gathered about the definition of sustainability from multiple different sources, the Cambridge Dictionary, the United Nations, and some of Westmont's own statements on it, are 1, that it's a quality of causing little to no damage to the environment. 2, it's the quality of being able to continue over time. 3, it's intergenerational and intercultural. No specific group has a corner on the sustainability market when we're talking about long-term sustainability for our planet. 4, it recognizes the Earth's ecosystems and the connectivity of our actions. It's guided by community relations and a concept of abundance rather than personal profit and scarcity. And it is adaptive and proactive. Ultimately, sustainability is making decisions with the future in mind. Along those lines, the United Nations has 17 Sustainable Development Goals that it's been pursuing since 2015. So this is becoming an increasingly common topic of discussion and awareness. So these 17 sustainable goals are no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnerships in pursuit of these goals. Do nuclear weapons fall under any of these definitions of sustainability? I would say it's pretty clearly a no. A lot of people believe very firmly that nuclear weapons are the only realistic solution to global security. All UN member states support these sustainable development goals, and yet 9 of those states still have nuclear weapons, and their allies want them to. These 9 nuclear weapon states have refused to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and many other treaties that would in many ways curb the development of nuclear weapons and the testing of them. The 9 states that possess nuclear weapons are very reticent to even participate in the conversation. So when you look at the gritty details of a nuclear war and how it would impact our planet, the disconnect between our understanding of sustainability and our policies is perplexing. I don't find fear motivating in any way, but I want to briefly describe the destructive power that these weapons hold because it moves us out of the confusion around policies and the confusion around theoretical jargon into something far more concrete. First, I'm going to share some things that can be kind of disturbing, just so you know. I'm not even going to share the worst of what we know because we don't need to go into that, but I think it's important to understand the magnitude of suffering that these bombs have already proved themselves capable of inflicting. This is what we're working against. August 6th and August 9th, 1945, the U.S. dropped 2 bombs on Japan, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki. Both flattened nearly 90% of the cities. And they did it in a torturous way. The damage in Hiroshima and Nagasaki came in 3 main forms. There were blasts, fire, and radiation. In Hiroshima, everything in a 2.2 mile diameter of the bomb was crushed by the initial shock wave. A fireball followed that was 1,200 feet in diameter and nearly 11,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the ground. Everything in that radius burst into flames spontaneously. From there, radiation sickness infected thousands of more people with various forms of cancer for years to come. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum recently took down an exhibit of wax figures depicting realistic injuries that people in Hiroshima had endured following the bombs. They took the figures away because people found them so disturbing. I remember being 12 and seeing them and just the impression that it left on me. It was incredibly awful to look at, but it was the truth. The figures depicted a mother, a child, and a young student with their clothes in tatters. Their skin was falling off their arms in shreds, exposing their raw skin underneath. Many survivors of Hiroshima recall people jumping into the river that runs through the city, trying to get some relief for their burning bodies. And the river quickly filled with bodies as they died. Those who were in the epicenter of the heat were incinerated, leaving their shadows etched into the stone around them. They're known as the Hiroshima Shadows. That sounds pretty horrifying. And the people alive today who witnessed this horror and who lived to talk about it were all children themselves. Thousands of those who didn't die immediately suffered from burns and horrible forms of cancer for years afterward, as I said. And yet the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Little Boy, as it was called, was one of the smallest ever used or tested. Things have only gotten bigger and more sophisticated. So what does that mean now, and what does that mean in relation to our environment? Our world is more densely populated, our technology is much better, and our conflicts have the potential to escalate so much faster. I want to cite some research done by Dr. Ira Helfand, who works with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW, who spoke at NAPF's Evening for Peace in 2017. I highly recommend looking up his talk, although it is hard to listen to, it's heavy. But Dr. Helfand has done extensive research on the global health effects of a nuclear war, and he's a wise voice of caution. As we know, climate change is already making large parts of our planet uninhabitable, or increasing parts of our planet uninhabitable, and conflict is going to increase in regions of severe environmental distress where resources are dwindling. Now more than ever, the risk of nuclear conflict is rising. So highly trained physicians and scientists at IPPNW did some case studies on the impacts of nuclear war. On a small scale, it's unfortunately believable that there could be a war between India and Pakistan. They aren't talked about as much as North Korea or Iran in the news, but they might be our most dangerous nuclear threat. They're the only nuclear-armed nations who have fought directly by exchanging gunfire since countries beyond the U.S. acquired nuclear weapons. So India and Pakistan each have around 150 nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, but that's growing steadily. And in a very conservative estimate, if the two countries each exchanged 50 rather small bombs like the one in Hiroshima, the damage would be devastating. 20 million people would die in the first week from the blast, fire, and radiation. That's about half of California. That's like us down to the Mexico border. We have about 23 million people in Southern California, and that would just be in a week. These bombs would each cause a firestorm, sending enough soot into the upper atmosphere to block out the sun across the entire planet, dropping temperatures, shortening the growing season, and causing worldwide famine. Taking into account people who live below the poverty line, who are malnourished, and who don't have access to reliable food sources already, IPPNW has estimated that worldwide, a small nuclear war like the one described would put 2 billion people at risk of starvation. And that wouldn't destroy our species, but the survivors would not necessarily be lucky to still be living on our ashen and ailing planet. We have bombs now that are big enough that dropping one 20 megaton bomb, which is not half as big as the largest one that the USSR ever tested, and not nearly the largest bomb that we have in existence, would make surface temperatures where the bomb was dropped hotter than the surface of the sun. Dropping that on New York City would obliterate all of it in a literal flash. With the amount of soot that would block out the sun, we'd effectively create an instant ice age. So beyond actual war, these weapons are a drain on our resources, which probably isn't surprising. They're a drain on our budget, for one. The Trump administration approved a new budget in 2018 to modernize nuclear weapons beyond what we're already doing, costing over $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years. That's something like $100,000 a minute. Imagine what we could spend that on instead. Education across our country, better infrastructure, healthcare, nourishing food for those who don't have access to it. We could use that $1.2 trillion to better take care of our people, our communities, and our land. Now, this modernization budget, I think it's important to say, was not just a matter of politics. It was actually a continuation of an Obama administration policy. Some people assume that Democrats would be more inclined to support nuclear disarmament, but that isn't exactly the case. Obama's policies weren't too different from Bush's or Trump's on this matter, although Trump's are becoming more volatile and more extreme. I know, for me at least, it's hard at times to understand the magnitude of the impact that I just described. You know how some people say that the death of one person is a tragedy while the death of thousands is a statistic. I think that's another reason that the myth that nuclear weapons are necessary, and the myth that we can't do anything about them, and the myth that peace is unrealistic. That's a reason these myths are able to persist. So maybe breaking it down into individual issues a little bit is a little more helpful for understanding just the magnitude of what we're talking about, and making it more relatable as well. Environmentally, even if these weapons aren't used, they're rusting in silos with highly toxic materials in them. This is a big sticking point where weapons and nuclear power plants do have a weakness in common. What do we do with their waste? That still hasn't been worked out sustainably. Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is another public health advocacy group, has a chapter in LA called PSR LA, and they're doing great work examining the intersectionality of different problems around nuclear weapons and waste. Nuclear waste that will take literally millions of years to become less toxic is being buried on Native American land and in areas of high poverty. And because of that, the health effects of this waste disproportionately affect women, children, the elderly, and minorities. This is an environmental issue, it's an equity issue, it's a justice issue, it's a feminist issue, it's a minority issue. Did I say that already? I might have. Sustainability absolutely requires examining and understanding this issue from all angles. And if sustainability operates under the assumption that we live in an intricate ecosystem, then we can't say nuclear weapons are the exception to the ecosystem. They're a deeply connected part of it. Many people argue that we have to use these, or that we have to have these weapons to make sure that nobody else uses them on us. This is the theory of deterrence. I've heard it called the porcupine theory as well, which is the idea that porcupines in the forest have spikes, and that's supposed to deter animals from attacking them. But human beings aren't porcupines, last time I checked, and we have biases and try to make meaning and deduce logic out of the information that we see in front of us that can lead to very different conclusions and very dangerous conclusions. Many political theorists and psychologists argue that we're actually making ourselves more of a target by keeping these weapons. States like Iran and North Korea argue that nuclear weapons are an equalizer, that having them is the ultimate symbol of independence and self-determination. The harder the U.S. holds on to its weapons, the more our adversaries believe they're in danger and need to escalate. A great example of that is Israel, while it has not publicly confirmed that it has nuclear weapons, is pretty strongly believed to have them. And the more the U.S. stands in support of Israel being allowed to have access to nuclear weapons, the more Iran is fearful of potential attacks since they aren't on the best terms with Israel. And so that cycle continues, that the two sides provoke each other, all in the name of supposed security, national security. There's a really interesting theory around conflict that I'm going to try to explain shortly and will probably butcher, but I think it's really interesting. It's called the security dilemma. It was created by a political scientist named Barry Posen, which says that often countries trying to defend themselves end up provoking other countries and sending the complete opposite message. Under the security dilemma, you might assume that your intentions are crystal clear to your opponent, but you also aren't going to give them all of your intelligence and actually make your intentions crystal clear. Which means that if you build a nuclear weapon and say it's to protect yourself, your enemy would be very rational to think you're actually planning to attack them. So when the U.S. modernizes its arsenal and tells Iran, you can't have nuclear weapons, but don't worry about us, it's logical that Iran would interpret that as a dangerous act, and it's pretty hypocritical. So deterrence theory is actually pretty illogical, and we can't give deterrence theory credit for not having a nuclear war so far. We've actually come dangerously close multiple times. Okay, so where we are, just to recap really quickly, is that these weapons that we argue are here to keep us safe, but ironically incredibly destructive in their power. And should they be used, they'd be unlike any horror that we've ever seen before. I mean, the ones that we have seen were already horrific, but again, the technology that we have now is completely different from the ones that we had in 1945. I now want to talk about some work that we're doing at NAPF that can help explain why we want to continue to do illogical things that threaten our planet's future, and what we can do about confronting those instances of being illogical, what we can do to confront these myths that we've been talking about. One of my colleagues at NAPF, Paul Chappell, who's our peace literacy director, often says the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I know that's a common saying. But I think that it's important to remember that most people aren't waking up every day saying, I want to make the world a terrible place to live today. We're just humans and we're messy and we make mistakes, but the stakes are getting higher and higher. In Greek mythology, Helios was the sun god, and his son Phaeton was half god, half mortal, which meant that he wasn't perfect like the gods. He had human fallibility. So Helios used to drive the sun chariot, according to Greek mythology, across the earth's sky every day, led by fire-breathing horses. Phaeton, his son, begged to have a chance to drive the chariot. Helios told Phaeton that he couldn't handle driving it, but Phaeton begged and begged until Helios gave in, and sure enough, Phaeton crashed the sun chariot into the earth. Interestingly, the fallout that's described in Greek mythology from this incident sounds like the fallout of a nuclear bomb. The oceans boil and the trees are instantly incinerated. As my colleague Paul says, the ancient Greeks probably couldn't foresee weapons as destructive as nuclear weapons, but they were well aware of human imperfection. Our technological capabilities have outpaced our moral and ethical frameworks for handling them. We need to focus on our ethical ability to reason, to understand the human condition, and to protect ourselves in order to survive and thrive in the face of serious existential threats. Threats like climate change and nuclear weapons. Most people are trying their very best to do what they think is right, to fulfill their duties and obligations, and to protect their families and their homes. I think that's an important thing to remember. But when a person's sense of right is ill-informed, it gets really dangerous. And this is where peace literacy comes in. This is work that we're doing at NAPF. Peace literacy is a concept and a curriculum that my colleague Paul has developed. It was interestingly born out of his time as a student at Westmont and as a captain in the Army. He spent 9 years in the Army, served a tour in Iraq, and then retired and came to work at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And he realized that we have to learn how to wage peace as intentionally and rigorously as we wage war. So peace literacy emphasizes that our understanding of human motivation and basic needs is pretty wrong. Maybe, misguided. Again, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But Maslow's hierarchy of needs says that we need food, water, safety, and shelter before anything else. So with existential issues like nuclear weapons or climate change, why are we threatening our own sense of safety or our access to clean food, water, and shelter? Peace literacy argues that we are actually more motivated by non-physical human needs, such as belonging, purpose, and self-worth. And peace literacy organizes these needs into an explanatory framework. It views peace both as a set of skills we can use to meet these non-physical needs in healthy ways, and as a set of capacities that must be developed for those skills to be realized. Peace literacy shows how oppressive systems and attitudes prevent us from perceiving each other's common humanity, and how these oppressive systems serve as blocks to empathy and to keeping us from seeing that we share basic human needs. So, basic human needs, for example, for a clean, safe, lasting environment. Our understanding of peace is only as good as our understanding of the human condition and of trauma. Peace literacy offers a new way of understanding the human condition and trauma, in a way that upends Maslow's hierarchy and shows how fulfilling our non-physical needs, such as purpose and meaning, helps us fulfill our physical needs. So up here, I just quickly threw up a basic, threw up on the screen here, a basic description of these basic non-physical needs that Paul has worked to identify through many different sources over a long period of time. And his argument is, isn't it interesting that that we talk about how food, water, safety, and shelter are our main sources of motivation, but people who have no food or water will go to great lengths if they have purpose to find food and water. Humans are capable of extraordinary feats when they have a sense of purpose or a sense of meaning. So Paul's description here, our work with peace literacy, talks about how different forms of trauma, and it's not just personal trauma, but maybe collective trauma in a culture or in a country, war trauma, racial trauma, different forms of violence contribute to our morphing of these non-physical needs into different forms of needs that are unhealthy. We call those the tangles of trauma. So for example, the need for purpose and meaning, when trauma is introduced into that, can contribute instead to a sense of meaninglessness and nihilism. The need for nurturing relationships, if trauma is introduced into that relationship, can lead to a sense of mistrust. When we're talking about nuclear weapons, that's a very clear one, that some of these countries like Iran and North Korea were, in the 1950s, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but they were both invaded by the U.S. and by our allies. And so they now say, again, that nuclear weapons are a form of protection, or could be a form of protection and self-determination. So, that trauma, relationships with other countries, led to this morphing, perhaps, of mistrust. So all of these needs, I can go through really quickly, but the need for explanations, the need to understand the world around us, when trauma is introduced into that, can lead to disillusionment and a ruthless worldview. And we can definitely see, again, I think, how nuclear weapons and how other forms of violence in our society can lead to a sense of disillusionment or a ruthless worldview, that we need to have nuclear weapons, we might need to bomb another country first before they bomb us. That's pretty ruthless. The need for expression, when it's capped, when we're not able to express ourselves, can lead to rage. The need for inspiration, when trauma is introduced into that, can lead to a sense of numbness or cynicism. What's the point? The need for belonging, when trauma is introduced, can lead to alienation. The need for self-worth, when trauma gets tangled up in that, can lead to shame and self-loathing. The need for challenge. Our species has evolved and reached such incredible heights with our inventions and our discoveries and science and technology. But when trauma is introduced into that, there can be a sense of helplessness. What's the point? Again, the need for transcendence, which can be fulfilled very healthily by relationships and by religion and ideas of a higher power. When trauma is introduced into that, can lead to addiction or addictive behavior. All ideas that are with addiction and addictive behavior, we're trying to maybe numb feelings that we don't feel the ability to make sense of or express. So jumping on from tangles of trauma, I'm going to leave this up, but I'm going to quote really quickly from our working paper on peace literacy in relation to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Without minimizing the importance of our physical needs, it is crucial to bear in mind that people who can't find a healthy way to meet their need for purpose, self-worth, worldview, and belonging can be more dangerous to global peace than people who can't find a healthy way to meet their need for food or water. Terrorists, however defined, are seldom motivated by hunger or thirst, but they're often motivated by unhealthy sources of purpose, self-worth, worldview, and belonging. So we can apply that framework with the tangles of trauma to our irrational desire to hold on to these nuclear weapons that could destroy us. For example, let's go back to Iran and North Korea, as I mentioned briefly. Talking about systemic national trauma, the U.S. interfered in elections in Iran in 1953 and overthrew their popularly elected prime minister. They put him in prison and reinstated the unpopular authoritarian Shah, who, in reaction, exiled another popular figure, Ayatollah Khomeini, who ended up coming back and starting a violent revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini fed off of a rage that the Iranian people shared over feeling violated and infantilized by having their beloved prime minister imprisoned and taken out of power. The U.S. interfered in Korea after World War II ended, forcefully overthrowing the Korean government that had started to naturally develop internally after the Japanese occupiers were kicked out. And the U.S. again reinstated an unpopular Korean faction, one that had been identified at least or viewed as supporting the Japanese occupiers. But the Americans backed this faction of Korean leaders because they were viewed as not being communist. Then when tensions got worse and worse in large part over that issue, and as tensions got worse with the Soviets, the Americans randomly drew a line on a map and split Korea in half. The South survived, the North suffered. So when you think about those traumas, not that it's justified, but is it any surprise that Iran and North Korea would both say that they have the right to keep nuclear weapons to protect themselves? The myth of nuclear security plays right into these traumas. So with that peace literacy framework in mind, let's quickly go back to the myths that we talked about earlier. Peace literacy helps explain why we hold on to these myths and how to understand the lack of truth behind them. Again, so that first myth was that nuclear weapons are a sustainable, necessary evil. People have said to me, in talking about my work, Japan bombed us first. Have you ever been to Pearl Harbor? You've only been to Hiroshima, so you've never seen what Japan did to your own country. Why do you care so much about what we did to Japan? People have developed a pretty ruthless worldview where they only want to look out for themselves and their own. Even politically, when we're talking about the mentality of make America great again, the assumption underlying that is, put America first, but not necessarily in ways that are healthy and normal, but in ways that are exceptionalist and potentially aggressive, very dangerous. Nuclear weapons rely on fear, and the assumption is that if we don't put ourselves first, we'll lose. Nuclear weapons feed on a ruthless worldview. They perpetuate mistrust, alienation, and cynicism, those tangles of trauma. The second myth that we were talking about is that experts must know what they're doing, so don't worry about it. And even if the experts don't know what they're doing, there's nothing that we as individuals can do about nuclear weapons. In response to that first part, that experts know what they're doing, JFK said that madness, mistake, or miscalculation could easily lead us into nuclear war. And we've come close many times with all three of those factors. There's a term for near-nuclear explosions or serious accidents called broken arrows. And some are due to technical malfunction, like an alarm system being tripped and telling a military base that it's under attack, and then in response would need to launch a nuclear weapon. Other broken arrows are due to shocking incompetence. For example, the American military has shipped nuclear warheads to the wrong facility on a couple occasions and had no clue where those warheads had gone for days. Again, we're human, we're phaeton. But the stakes in this situation are incredibly high. So our supposed experts are human, and they're just as sensitive to these tangles of trauma as the rest of us. Ruthless worldviews, mistrust, cynicism, and dehumanization are thriving across the world right now. We're seeing a rise of extremism, not just in the U.S., but extremist politicians are getting more of a platform in Brazil and in Western Europe as well. We hear people shouting, build the wall, or lock her up, or send them back, and their chants that our president is sanctioning. There's nothing that individuals can do about nuclear weapons is that second misconception. Often people suggest writing to your elected officials or protesting or other things. And all of those are very important. They're part of having a sense of agency and taking responsibility. That's very important. But when we're talking about sustainability, all of those policies that we work so hard to enact can be thrown out the minute somebody new takes office. That's something that we're seeing now with the Paris Agreement, with the Iran deal, with the INF Treaty, which was another nuclear agreement with Russia. All of them have been torn up under Trump. Relying on our governments to make permanent change isn't working. So taking things back a little bit and focusing on the local, focusing on education and on interpersonal relations, those are things that are lasting and sustainable, and I think they're a solid foundation from which we can build up. I think the environmental movement is doing a great job, actually, of giving people a sense of agency and ownership. Educate yourself, reduce your carbon footprint, support local businesses, and identify small changes that you personally can make that, for yourself may not make too much of an impact overall, but they still matter. They build up. They're one small step that needs to be taken, but they're very important ones. And at NAPF, we think that in terms of nuclear weapons, peace literacy can contribute to that sense of agency. Learning how to practice empathy on a deeper level, learning how to understand yourself better, and learning how to transform your community and contribute to healthy ways of meeting our 9 non-physical human needs. Those are all things that we can learn how to do. So that third myth was that peace is an abstract concept or a sentimental wish. And in regard to that, my main job at NAPF is to fundraise and to build partnerships that we want to be long-lasting and sustainable. Something that I also hear a lot of people say when I talk to them about peace is that it's unrealistic. I was at an event earlier this year where a potential funder said, a lot of us, when we think about peace, picture people in tie-dye shirts, holding hands, dancing around a fire, and singing songs. Peace is something that people often picture, I think, in those terms, that it's more of a wishing somebody well or a hallmark greeting, but we don't necessarily think about how to actually achieve it that often, or as often as we should, maybe. I think that's another myth standing in the way of sustainable solutions. I see a parallel, again, to the climate change movement when people say, when skeptics say people are overreacting, it still snows in the winter and the oceans don't look like they're drying up, so what's the big deal? We can't be complacent in that way. I think with peace, people don't realize that a lot of hard work and preparation and research goes into knowing how to be effectively and sustainably peaceful. For me, at least, growing up, I often looked at figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. and thought that peace was a character virtue. Some people had it and others didn't. But in reality, I think there's a lot more hard work and preparation that goes into it, and it's possible for everybody, theoretically, to develop those skills. For example, I had no idea until I started working at NAPF, but I learned that nonviolent activists who staged sit-ins at lunch counters during the civil rights movement in the South actually prepared for those sit-ins at times by shouting at each other and punching each other. And the idea behind that, they were doing it in a very safe and intentional environment, but they were doing it so that they'd know what it felt like and they'd know how to respond in the moment when when people who weren't part of their group were actually doing it to them to be violent, they would be able to respond peacefully. So I thought that was a really interesting thing that I had never learned about, but there was a lot of preparation that went into being nonviolent. It wasn't just, suppressing feelings of frustration or rage. It was learning how to effectively channel those things. So I think that contributes to a more realistic understanding of what peace actually is and how peace work and peacemaking are realistic practices and skill sets that can be developed. So peace literacy, in response to this myth that peace is insubstantial, has created curriculum that we're offering primarily to K through 12 students, although we've done it in universities and schools of higher education as well. We offer it for free, especially to teachers across the country. This fall, peace literacy curriculum is being implemented with 1,000 students across grade levels in Oregon and New York State, from kindergarten up to seniors in high school. Students are going to learn how to demonstrate respect, to listen empathetically, to recognize forms of dehumanization, and to listen skeptically to myths that are motivated by trauma and the messy world that we live in. These are skills that can be practiced and honed. And if we start young, I think there's a lot more potential for raising a generation and future generations that are more equipped in peacemaking. We've got to figure out our society if we're going to figure out the environment, and that's where peace literacy comes in. Trying to understand our society and how people work and the root causes that are showing up through symptoms like climate crisis and nuclear weapons. The first step, again, is understanding the human condition. I think it's really interesting that the Hebrew word shalom is often explained to mean peace, but I recently discovered that it actually means more than that the root of shalom means wholeness and completeness. It suggests that peace is one part of a much bigger picture, that it's a positive symptom of wholeness and of goodness. Just as nuclear weapons have to be addressed as part of our sustainability framework, peace is just one part of our end goal for a whole, healed planet. In terms of a healthy environment, peace is an essential ingredient. Many studies have been done on the economic benefits of peaceful agreements, on the environmental benefits, on how peace positively impacts equity and justice. But getting to peace is hard work. Again, it isn't just a sentimental wish. It's hard work, and it starts with us. So with that, I thank you for letting me be here to speak with you today, and I feel really fortunate to be sharing with you and working towards the same goal. So thank you.
All right, about 10 plus minutes for questions. You guys have any questions?
Cool.
I know I do.
It's all good.
It was awesome.
A question back there? Not to interrupt.
I understand how it would be great if nuclear weapons would go away
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, but how do we go about the process of disarmament without making ourselves vulnerable to attacks from other countries that maybe aren't following those policies?
That's such a good question. I know that's like at the core of that whole issue. You know, how do we actually effectively disarm? And I think we've seen success that started with conversations around the table. You know, that if, for example, with the Iran nuclear deal, when Iranian delegates and American delegates and delegates from the European Union were all able to sit together and kind of take the threat of sanctions and the threat of other things against Iran off the table, that's when the conversation started to actually get interesting. So I think that ultimately getting to that point where disarmament can be realistic and where both sides are agreeing to reduce their arms has to start with an agreement of mutual respect and mutual understanding. And that sounds so obvious and maybe straightforward, but that hasn't really played out too much. For example, when the Iran deal was signed into law, it's a bummer, but right after the Iran deal was signed, which was a big deal, it took months and months and months of negotiation, both sides were publicly saying, even Obama was saying something about we're still gonna, if they disregard the deal, we're gonna punish them for it. So I think, it kind of ties into that idea of a carrot and a stick. What's the better incentive? The threat of smacking someone or trying to sweeten the deal a little bit. Which at NAPF, at least for us, ties back into the idea of peace literacy and learning to demonstrate respectful and empathetic listening and conversation.
I thought it was an interesting point about, you were saying what Elizabeth Warren was kind of working on something about kind of making some kind of a ban on our, executive branch not being able to attack under certain, well, at least not attack first. Because it seems like, if our president and other prime ministers got together, they said, yeah, we're not going to do this. The second someone new comes in, they could just be like, nah, now I'm here. And honestly, I imagine that the kind of person who would get the support of a lot of people is probably someone who would say, they're taking away, our past political regime took away our power, I'm coming back to defend us with nuclear weapons. And I think a lot of people in a country would rally around that person.
Totally.
So the idea of setting policies that would prevent such a quick overturning of those kinds of past agreements would be necessary.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and maybe I totally agree with you. I think that that isn't the end goal from my perspective, but it is so important to have those safeguards. I'd interpret that as being a safeguard. That the president can't just launch a nuclear weapon on a whim because there are policies in place that can't just be changed from one administration to the next. I think that's really important. It's a step, for sure. So, yeah. Are you guys all political science students, environmental students? What drew you to this? Is this required for class? I know how that goes, but
Maybe some incentive.
Yes, environmental studies class.
Awesome.
We were required to go a few of the sustainability ones.
nice.
I just thought it was interesting.
Cool.
My dad's worked in the defense sector, so I saw I just thought it was interesting.
Cool. Yeah, and that's such an important part of the conversation too, for sure. That we can't just. I think there's been some tension between the peace activist side of the movement and the defense sector. I think that the defense sector often sees people working for peace as, again, maybe being unrealistic. I mean, even Nikki Haley, the ambassador to the UN from, I think, 2017 to 18, said, I would love for the world to be rid of nuclear weapons, but we have to be realistic. So I feel like, and I think, at NAPF, we're trying to figure out how we can bridge that gap. Instead of just having two sides that are talking past each other, how can we actually sit at the table and take each other seriously? I think that's really important.
Sorry.
No,
Never mind. I had a question about the peace literacy, and I know that's not entirely like your sector, but you know a lot about it. Is there you talk about how it's being taught in kindergarten and everything? I kind of have two questions. I want to know, I think that's super cool and a great idea. I want to know an example of how that's taught, and then also, do you ever face any difficulties trying to implement that in schools, or any districts oh no, why would we teach that, or is it
totally received? Yeah, no, those are both really good questions. First, so when it comes to how we're actually teaching this in schools, it's interesting. It starts we have all these free lesson plans online. Our website is peaceliteracy.org, and I have some stuff in the back if you're interested in taking a look at it. But starting in kindergarten, our main goal is to have teachers who are specialized in working with certain age groups be able to teach this in their own way. We aren't specialized in working with kindergartners, so how can a kindergarten teacher adapt the concepts that we're working with to kindergartners? But for example, my coworker Paul told me about one talk he did specifically with kindergartners, actually, where he just focused on specific concepts, and he started with talking about empathy. So that was kind of easing younger kids into it by talking about big concepts and how they relate to the way we interact with each other. He was saying it was kind of awesome that with kindergartners in particular, he wasn't sure if they'd be able to grasp this idea of empathy. But once he started talking about it, they went off on this tangent about bugs and said bugs are so misunderstood and they're more afraid of us than we are of them, and that must be how people feel. So I remember talking with him about that because it was such a sweet point that even kids as young as 5 years old can't grasp this, and I think we don't give them enough credit. So that's one thing, and I think kind of connected to that, the idea that maybe some school districts have pushback or hesitation. We do encounter that a lot, and I think one reason is, again, that they say maybe it isn't a priority. It's funny, my coworker Paul talks about how school districts might say, or a teacher might say, can you come in and give a 30-minute talk this year on peace literacy, and then next year come and give another 30-minute talk. And he says you wouldn't do that with a geometry teacher. You don't say we're going to have a 30-minute talk on geometry this year and then I'll come back and do 30 more minutes next year. But the idea of, I think, developing emotional intelligence and figuring out how to work effectively and healthfully with other people isn't something that we grasp as being that important. I think we think that it's intuitive, or it's just something that you pick up as you go. So that's one reason. And another reason, interestingly, is some teachers, some more academic or traditional academics, who don't like the idea that Maslow's hierarchy would be questioned. We've actually gotten a lot of pushback on that. So I don't really know what to say to that, but yeah, it's definitely a process.
I partially also wonder, it's kind of safe to in schools to stick to math, science, history, but to not really talk about global issues that are kind of developing, which I would say would be something like peace literacy in the context of nuclear war, talking about things like climate change, even talking about something like self-care. These are things that we don't learn in school. But I wonder if that's just because there's kind of there's less I don't know, maybe agreement or consensus on what does it mean to think about these things well, whereas it's easy to talk about geometry. I don't know.
Right, that's a really good point. Again, isn't it? Yeah, there's something interesting there with the assumption that maybe geometry is a safe subject, and talking about self-care or interacting healthily with other people can be politicized or can go off the deep end.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess it could. I'm trying to, I don't know.
Maybe it's kind of thing that like a church, or like, I don't know, almost like things in church. We're probably not used to going to church. Like there are things that like at church, they're like, oh, we don't talk about that, we'll leave that for you to talk about at home.
Yeah.
But at home, they're like, we're not going to talk about that, we're going to let you talk about that at school.
Yeah.
School's like, we're not going to talk,
Yeah, exactly,
So
a hot
unless
potato.
you seek it out, then you're really not going to get any good education on X topic, whatever it is.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's making me think of, do you listen to This American Life?
A little bit. I've listened to a few
Yeah.
episodes.
Yeah. Yesterday's episode, I think it was, they talk about how Oklahoma became the first state to offer like universal daycare or universal preschool, because they recognized the incentive or like the benefits of having like toddlers getting a head start on education. But it was funny that the point of the episode, or the point of this segment of the episode, was that like totally unexpectedly, many legislatures in the Oklahoma Senate said like, why would you offer free preschool? Because like that's like overstepping your boundaries as the state. So I guess, it's funny how that kind of ties into it too, that like things that, the angle that This American Life is taking at least was like, this is a good thing, right? It's free education for all these kids. But people interpret it so differently. Our lenses are calibrated so differently. It was maybe a tangent from what you were saying. Sorry, I was like,
Yeah.
woo. But
Of course. Do you guys have questions or?
yes.
I think so. Something I'm having a little bit of trouble reconciling is if we as man are faith on and imperfect, obviously, driving chariots into the sea, then how is peace a realistic wish? Because if man really is imperfect and history shows us always warring against each other looking for the top, then how could we have peace without the threat of man backing us?
That is such a good question, and I'm like feeling anxious as I think about it because I want to give you a good answer. So that's a really good question. I think ultimately, as my colleague Paul talks about a lot, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That when we're just operating out of good intentions, yeah, absolutely, peace agreements fall through, and when we don't have the proper research and backing, it always falls through. But I also think that we're seeing more and more reasons to have hope that, yeah, we're always going to make mistakes, we're always going to be faith on, we're always going to, at least go close to crashing the chariot back into the sea. But the more information that we have and the more we build on these skills that we're talking about, the more potential there is for sustainable peace, at least. And that doesn't mean like perfect peace, but something, a framework that we can work within where a disagreement wouldn't be catastrophic and world-ending. Yeah, I'm gonna think about that more though.
One of my foremost thoughts is also kind of in this idea, which is similar to climate action. People kind of ask me about, what can I do? I don't think that our climate crisis is going to be solved by people only paying attention to how to recycle better, how to use less plastic, how to buy local. I think it is much more about a spiritual change.
Yeah.
And actually doing personal work within ourselves, then which is hard and it's scary. Addressing personal trauma and these things, and honestly, a lot of people will be like, how does that matter to climate change? But really, it gets us to realize that a lot of times we act only on our own behalf because we're undermined by our own experiences and our own traumas that cause us to reel it in. If someone hurts you, you say, I'm going to punch you in the face, whatever it is.
Right.
But it seems like, whereas climate change is caused by so many people contributing to one or many issues, something like nuclear war seems like that's really just warring egos between a few select people who I don't think these people are ever going to do that kind of internal work, because it takes a certain kind of ego to want to be, or to convince other people to elect you to be a ruler of a nation. And I guess that's kind of where I would say, will that inner work ever be done by these people? I don't know.
That's a good question.
Because those aren't the people who resonate with the people in their country who are mad and want their country to kick other countries' butts.
You're totally right. And I think did you have more on that? I don't want
No, go ahead.
to blabber. But I think something I really appreciate in thinking about that is definitely the majority of countries, and the pattern that we see is very closely, I think, in line with that the people who are ruling these countries, especially now, I mean, in Brazil, what's going on? The Amazon's burning and Bolsonaro isn't doing anything about it. He's turning a blind eye. He wanted to elect his son as ambassador to the U.S., which is a super cushy position. You were seeing a lot of entitlement, God, everywhere. But for me, at least, I guess I try to come back to the few examples where that wasn't the case. I think about Nelson Mandela, for example. And I know that referring back to Nelson Mandela when we're talking about peace can be kind of cliched, but he transformed an entire nation. I think about Rwanda, where they had actual sustainable resolution to a decades-long civil war. Those examples are out there. I think it's just figuring out what the common thread in those instances was, and that gives me hope. It doesn't necessarily mean that that'll happen for us, but it does give me hope. So, whatever that's worth. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you
so
guys.
much.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.